சிறப்புரையை ஆற்றுவதற்கு கலாநிதி இந்திரஜித் குமாரசாமி ஐயா அவர்கள், முன்னாள் ஆளுநர், இலங்கை மத்திய வங்கி, மனிதநேயம் உள்ள சிறந்த பொருளியலாளராக மாண்புமிகு பணிகள் பல ஆற்றியிருக்கக்கூடியவர். அவர்களை கௌரவித்து அரங்கிற்கு அறிமுகம் செய்து வைப்பதற்காக மதிப்பார்ந்த டாக்டர் நாகேந்திரன் ஐயா அவர்களை அழைக்கின்றோம்.
Welcome, good evening. I think Naga has made, excuses for my lack of ability to speak in Tamil. வணக்கம். நான் மன்னியங்க, எனக்கு தமிழில் கதைக்க கஷ்டமாக இருக்குது. ஏனென்றால் நான் சின்ன காலத்திலே வெளியூருக்கு போனேன். இனி தமிழில் இப்போ கதைக்க போனேன் என்றால் அது சரி வராது. இனி நான் இங்கிலீஷில் கதைக்க போகிறேன். Let me say that it's a great privilege to deliver the Sangrapulla Memorial Lecture this year, and I thank Dr. Nage for inviting me to deliver these remarks. Clearly, Dr. Sangrapulla was a giant, particularly as far as the Colombo Tamil community was concerned. This building and the very lively and very rich activities of the Sangam is testimony to what he started amongst the community in this area. So it's a particular privilege to be able to come and deliver this lecture. Now I suspect that most of you in this audience probably know about the subject I'm going to speak about than I do. That is the revival and development of the northern economy. It is not an area that I'm particularly knowledgeable about, but I will try to share some thoughts from a broader perspective. I'm going to start by talking about the need to have very sound macroeconomic policies in this country. Having a central banking background, you won't be surprised that that is where I'm going to start. Because unless one has macroeconomic stability, you can't have development in any part of the country. It becomes much more difficult. Second thing I want to do is talk about is the European experience. Europe was racked by war for over a century. And in that period it had 2 world wars, tremendous destruction. And at the end of it, the way they've created peace and sustainable peace is by having greater integration on the European continent. So I think we need to see whether there are any lessons for us there. The third area I'd like to focus on is integration with India. India is booming. It is expected to be the fastest growing large economy in this decade, and see whether that opens up opportunities for Sri Lanka as a whole, but particularly for the north, which is very well positioned to take advantage of the particular dynamism that is currently being experienced in the 5 southern states of India. And finally, I want to share some thoughts about specific things that could be done in the northern province. So what about sound macroeconomic policies? You know, at the time of independence, Sri Lanka was second to Japan on most socio-economic indicators. The regression we've experienced since then, in my view, is to a significant extent caused by macroeconomic stress. And the main cause of that macroeconomic stress has been the government's budgetary policies. The government's budgetary policies have been afflicted by a toxic combination of populist politics and an entrenched entitlement culture amongst all of us as the people of Sri Lanka. And those 2 phenomena have fed off each other in a kind of negative feedback loop and have dragged us down. So we need to break that cycle in order to progress. So, unless one breaks that cycle, unless one has more sound fiscal management of the economy, and if also over the last 40-50 years, the fiscal indiscipline and the effects of that fiscal indiscipline have been compounded by fiscal forbearance in monetary policy. The central bank was too ready to print money to finance the government's deficit. it was too ready to have what we call financial repression. That is to force interest rates down to find cheap money for the government. That is not really the business of the central bank. It was dominated by the politicization that has taken place of the central bank over the last many years. But that is what is now, the hope is that this will be changed by the new Central Bank Act. So we have to break out of that, this kind of rather constraining compulsions that come from this macroeconomic stress that the country has experienced over almost from the time of independence. In fact, a famous British economist, Professor Joan Robinson from Cambridge, came to Sri Lanka in 1959. And she said, you Ceylonese, it was Ceylon then, you Ceylonese have eaten the fruit before you planted the tree. That is what had happened, really. We had all these welfarist policies and we consumed, but we didn't have increased productivity and produce and have sufficient real growth in the economy that the people of the country could sustain. So what do we do about this? There are two measures that I think are going to be part of the government's policies going forward. One is there's a Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, which was actually enacted about 2002 or 2003. It sets certain targets for the government's debt and the government's deficit. And there's a timeline within which these targets have to be reached. But every time we come close to the end of the timeline, Parliament extends the deadline. So it's utterly ineffective, the law. It lacks teeth. So I hope that the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act will be given more teeth by making sure that any amendment to it, any extension of the deadline, requires a special majority in Parliament. That you can't do it with a simple majority, but you have to do it with a 2/3 or maybe even a 75% majority. Because otherwise, this continuous fiscal profligacy is likely to continue. I don't see our politicians learning any lessons, even in this crisis. One sees that their behavior hasn't really changed very much, which is very concerning. So I think we need to tie our hands by having clear frameworks for making fiscal policy and monetary policy and embedding it in the law. So one thing to do is to strengthen the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act by embedding the primary surplus as a clear target. That is, the government's total revenue must exceed total expenditure minus interest payments. If you achieve that, you do not add to the debt stock. You are able to meet the current year's expenditure out of the current year's revenue. If you do not do that, you're constantly going to get into the debt problem. So that's one that should be part of the targets in the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, and any changes to it, in extending deadlines, etc., should require a special majority in Parliament. Ideally 75%, I think, not even more than 2/3, because this has been such a problem for us. We need to make it very difficult for our political masters to be as indisciplined as they have been over the last many years. And on the central bank side, the central bank is put under enormous pressure to print money, to keep interest rates down, for the government to get cheap money. And of course, if you keep interest rates lower than they should be in terms of the overall macroeconomic dynamics, then you have too much credit, too much money creation, and inflation. So one, stop the central bank from investing in the primary market for treasury bills, and two, move away from this financial repression by setting interest rates through market determination. So that's in a nutshell what I feel should be done in terms of strengthening macroeconomic policy making and attacking what has been the main cause, in my view, for our regression from the lofty position that we enjoyed in Asia at the time of independence. Now, the second theme I mentioned was the EU project, the formation of the European Union. Now, of course, things that work in one part of the world will not necessarily work in another part of the world. And things that work at a particular time in history will not work necessarily in another time in history. But still, I think we need to have an open mind and examine things that have happened elsewhere to see whether there are any lessons there for us to learn. Now, as I said, Europe went through more than a century of war, almost continuous war in Europe. And the main theater of war was between France and Germany. And there were two world wars and the terrible destruction that they wrought in the European continent and globally. So at the end of the Second World War, Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, and Konrad Adenauer, the president of Germany, got together and decided one way to avoid war, to put an end to war on the European continent, was to find ways and means of integrating the European economies more and more. Their thesis was that if economies are integrated, people will not go to war against each other. So this is something we need to think about as well. Are there ways and means of integrating the northern economy with the rest of the Sri Lankan economy? Will that help? You can have supply chains in agriculture, supply chains in fisheries, supply chains in terms of IT and BPO. So there are various ways in which you can link the northern and southern economies, and if those linkages are strong and sustainable, then I suspect the prospects of having lasting peace and reconciliation would be greater, in my view. So that's something we need to think about. And that doesn't mean that one gives up some of the issues that are still live. Issues in terms of the implementation of the 13th Amendment, the missing persons, reparations. These are all things that should continue to be talked about. But I think there's a bigger picture one should have one's eyes on, and that is to see how one integrates the various parts of Sri Lanka, north and south, east and west, etc. Greater integration will give great, in my view, a sustained basis for peaceful development of the whole country. In Europe, they started with the European Coal and Steel Agreement in 1952 and then went all the way to the euro as a single currency for the whole European area. So that's the kind of thing that one can think about to see how whether we can learn lessons in terms of our own circumstances. Then the other point that I wanted to turn to is integration with India, greater integration with India. And this is not just for the northern province, it's for the whole of Sri Lanka. I think if we want to get out of the situation we are in now, if one option that is there for us to take as a country, and the north has a particular advantage because of proximity to India, but for the whole country, there is the prospect of really latching on to what is happening in India. So what is happening in India? India, many professional economists say, India is going to be the fastest growing large economy in the next decade. And Prime Minister Modi has said that he wants to make India a global supply chain hub. A lot of the supply chains that are moving out of China because of the fracturing of the global economy and the concerns that have emerged in terms of globalization and the need that many countries now feel to take greater care in terms of their dependence on China is playing into India's hands. It's benefiting India. Billions of dollars of investment are going into India. And now if India does take off, it has been growing quite fast, But if it has real takeoff in the way that China took off or Japan took off, then Sri Lanka should be able to benefit from that. Because if you study what happened when first Japan and then China took off, all the countries in that region benefited by hooking into the Japanese and Chinese supply chains. So we can replicate that here as well. And earlier, though we had proximity to India, and we've had proximity forever, of course, but it was very difficult to do cross-border business, particularly have cross-border supply chains, because infrastructure in both countries was so weak. The roads were bad, the ports were bad, the airports were bad. So the transaction costs of doing business across the borders was very high, and therefore it didn't make much sense to have these cross-border supply chains. But now infrastructure in both countries is improving, and therefore the basis for having cross-border supply chains has got much more propitious. So that is another opportunity, and the north of the country, given its proximity to particularly the 5 southern states of India, that is Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Telangana, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, all of them are booming. So we are here 20 miles across the Pork Strait. And if now there's an international airport, hopefully KKS port will also be restored and revitalized. The Rameswaran Talaimana ferry hopefully will be revived, and therefore those transport links will also be stronger, which will give a further boost to possible economic activity across the two countries. So if you take all that together, I think that is another opportunity that the north, the country, not just the north, the whole country in fact, needs to grasp in the years going forward. Let me now turn to the north in particular, and some ideas about what one can do specifically about the north. I think around 2017, the late Mangala Samaraveera became concerned about what was happening in north. That was the time when there were these suicides, particularly of women in the north, because of indebtedness. Now, the strategy after the war ended was to restore major infrastructure, the railroad, the roads, etc., the air roads, etc., and 2, to provide microcredit for the people for self-employment opportunities. Now, the restoration of the infrastructure was obviously useful, though the infrastructure that particularly benefited small producers were not really focused upon. It was the main trunk roads and the railroad, etc., but that in itself was beneficial. But the using microcredit to provide financing for a population that had been caught up in a conflict for 30 years, and when there was enormous pent-up consumption, putting money into the hands of those people and expecting them to then use it productively was not really very realistic. Clearly they were going to spend on things they hadn't spent for 30 years. The consumption items they had been deprived of for 30 years. Equally, the 30-year war also deprived some of the most dynamic people who had left those areas. And the people who were there, some of them, did not have the wherewithal to take opportunities in terms of self-employment. It was asking too much of them, of a population that had been caught up in a 30-year conflict, to find the wherewithal to have successful self-employment projects. So people got into trouble. They took the debt, spent it on consumption, didn't have the capability to have successful self-employment opportunities, and they were indebted and could not get out of the debt trap. And there were, as I said, sometimes even suicides of a number of women in that area. So that attracted Mangala Samarveera's attention. Also in the central bank, we were very concerned because the central bank is the regulator of these finance companies. And we wanted to see what we could do to do things better so that that kind of problem did not persist. So with that, there was an interest that was particularly focused upon the North. And also at that time, Dr. Ahilan Kadirgama came and spoke to us at the central bank and with the minister. And he put together a team of 5 eminent Jaffna-based academics and really thinkers. They were some of the professionals. I would put them as 5 eminent professionals, and they developed a framework for development for the northern province. This framework was then presented by Mangala Samarveera to the donor community, and this was in 2019, and the donor community was very interested, and they wanted the framework fleshed out into projects and programs which they could support. But of course, the government changed, and sadly, Mangala Samarveera is no more. So that work is still in abeyance, but that framework is still available. If you go into the central bank or the treasury websites, you will see it. And it's still a framework. It needs to be translated into projects, programs, activities, etc. But it's an extremely useful framework in my view, in terms of pointing the direction in which one can have a holistic approach. You know, there is tremendous amount of good work being done, particularly by diaspora Tamils who have come back and have done a tremendous amount of social work to uplift particularly those who are in need. And that work is extremely helpful, and it needs to be lauded. But you also need an overall framework and a holistic approach to develop the whole of the northern province. And in order to do that, it's important to have a development agency. Mangala Samarveera talked about having a coordinating entity in the Ministry of Finance to do that. It could be in the Ministry of Finance, but in my view it would be better to have a development agency which is chaired by the district secretary, and which includes all the divisional secretaries, but also people from the private sector, from civil society, from the diaspora, to have representation from all those stakeholders and to develop a holistic program for the development of the northern province. Now the areas with promise are well known, right? There's agriculture, there's fisheries, there's IT, and those are the 3 most obvious areas. There could be others. Now, when it comes to agriculture, we need to be very careful. You know, agriculture in Sri Lanka employs 27% of the labor force and gives us only about 7 or 8% of GDP. What that means is that productivity in agriculture is exceedingly low. And so we trap a large segment of our population in low productivity, low income economic activity. We get their noses above the water, and we do that in a very expensive way. There is free water, there is a fertilizer subsidy, there is a guaranteed price. All these things have to come from the government's fiscal outlays. And in the foreseeable future, the government's capacity to make those outlays is going to be severely constrained. So we need to find another way of doing this. We need to modernize agriculture so that productivity is higher and people are able to stand on their own feet. So it's known, this is not rocket science. Our people in agriculture know what to do. But it's the politics that has to be put right. Because politicians are scared to take away subsidies. They're scared to take some tough decisions. It's tough love, but it's in the long run, it's good for the country and the people, but in the short run, there will be disruption. So one has to get through that. In fact, there was a team from Harvard that did some work in Sri Lanka. They said at our level of development, only 15% of the population should be in agriculture, not 27. So we have this surplus in agriculture, and at the same time we say we don't have enough labor. We don't have enough labor for the apparel sector. We don't have enough labor for the tourism sector. That's simply because we are, as I said, trapping people in low productivity, low income agriculture. We need to basically make these changes. Very difficult. It's very easy to stand here and talk about these things, but politically tough decisions have to be made. But these are the kind of decisions we have to make if we are to put the country on a new course which takes us away from this repeating cycles of instability that has taken us to where we are today. You know, the framework that I talked about, it looks at three pillars, three interdependent pillars to develop this holistic strategy. One is the factors of production, land, labor, capital. The other is the enabling environment, and the third is the social foundations of development. So in terms of the, as I said, the factors of production, we need to have affordable investment capital, affordable working capital, and the Jaffna of all the areas in the country has had a very successful cooperative movement over the years. And I think Ahilan and his team are working very hard to revive the cooperative banks and the cooperative thrift societies who are able to provide credit in a much more targeted way to the small producers who have difficulty in getting finance. And the labor as well, to try to increase female labor force participation. There, of course, childcare, safe transport, etc., are things that need to be attended to. And then land is an intractable problem. The state owns 80% of the land in the country. It's very difficult for anybody to get land to do business. I know lots of people who've come from abroad who've tried to get land to invest and create employment for the people of the area. Extremely difficult to get land because of the state's control of land. So we need to find more business-friendly ways of handling land. Water, again, clearly that's crucial in the north. That's a major constraint. So the minor irrigation tanks, we need to rehabilitate them. Then the Iranamadu tank. For years we've talked about how to harness that water for the northern province. So we need to take firm decisions and move ahead on that front. Land fragmentation, particularly in the peninsula, the land is highly fragmented. It's very difficult to have economically viable units. So we need to find the ways and means of having critical mass in the land. Now in Thailand, they have farmer organizations, somewhat similar to our cooperatives. So we've got to look at ways and means of overcoming this problem of land fragmentation, whereby the size distribution of holdings are so small that they're really unviable without massive subsidy from the government, and the government no longer has the money to provide those subsidies. And then the enabling environment, technology, research and development, infrastructure, particularly infrastructure which supports the small producers, regulations which protect the natural resource base, but without being a hindrance and a burden on business. You need to facilitate business through these regulations, which are necessary to protect the natural resource base and to have health and safety standards, but they shouldn't be a burden in terms of adding costs. And one should strengthen state institutions to provide effective support, particularly through building up producer organization and networks. Markets to develop local, regional and international supply chains. You know, when it comes to SMEs, there are 4 areas where you need to intervene and look after. One is training at the beginning, so that the people have the wherewithal and the knowledge to undertake economic activity through their SMEs. The second is inputs. They need to be able to obtain the inputs for their economic activity. Third is financing, affordable financing. And the fourth, and affordable financing not by financial repression and forcing interest rates down artificially, but by having sound macroeconomic framework which actually gives you a low interest rate naturally by having the kind of stability in the system. But the most intractable problem is marketing. If you clear the marketing channel, everything else falls into place. If you have a way of marketing your product, you'll get the financing you need. You can go and buy the inputs, you can get training, etc. You need to clear marketing, you need to create supply chains. For that, you need these various kind of centers. At first, I think there's been talk of having an economic center in Kilinochchi, and that should move ahead. And then some satellite, I think they've talked of about 10 satellite centers, economic centers in the rest of the northern province. So all these things I think should be put in place so that you have as I said, a holistic approach to tackling the marketing problem. So for instance, in fisheries, we need the cold chain, we need maybe trawlers, whatever. You need investment to take the activity into a higher level. Housing, we think the government has to do everything. That if there are houses to be built, that the government has to build houses. Well, the government no longer has money to build anything, really. So again, we need to see now the diaspora community, which is doing so much work, to see whether the diaspora community can get together and provide affordable housing for those in need. So these are, I think, new ways of helping. And I think also providing grants and low-cost loans through the Cooperative Rural Bank and the Thrift and Credit Committees. Those members of the diaspora who want to help can see whether they can channel money through these financial institutions. Because Highland Kadirgame is the person you should get in touch with. He is doing an enormous amount of work in strengthening the systems in these institutions so that you can have greater confidence in terms of giving them money. So that's something to be considered. So those are some thoughts that I thought I would share with you. So let me conclude basically by saying that while we should not forget the past and the issues that still remain unresolved, it is extremely important to look forward and to grasp the opportunities that are out there. Not to wait for the government to do things, but for the community, the entrepreneurial community in the northern province, the diaspora, all can get together and scan the landscape, see what the opportunities are. I try to identify some of them and then really to grasp them and move forward. I must finish by sharing an anecdote told to me by an extremely senior official of the Asian Development Bank. He said, when I attend various meetings, when I go to East Asia and have representatives of those countries at a meeting. Now, as you know, Japan and Korea have had a very troubled history. Japan and China have had a very troubled history. Yet, he said, when these countries get together, they are very pragmatic. They're trying to work out how to make money and to focus on the commercial opportunities that are out there. He said in South Asia, whenever the countries of the region got together, they moaned about what has happened over the last 75 years. They accused each other of this happened, that happened, you did this, you did that. And that is all they focus upon. He says the meeting finishes and the agenda of the day is largely ignored. I think we mustn't fall into that trap because there are opportunities that can be grasped and we should focus on that and go ahead and look to the future with confidence and I think in a very pragmatic and open-minded way. Thank you all very much for your time.
ขอบคุณครับท่านประธานครับ ท่านประธานครับ 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 ท่านประ
அறிவின் ஆளுமையால் பண்பின் சிகரமாய் இலங்கையின் பொருளாதார புத்துயிர் குறித்த நன்றென சிறப்பு செய்த நிலையில் நல்லதாம் நனிநல்ல உரை செய்திருக்கக்கூடிய முன்னாள் ஆளுநர் இலங்கை மத்திய வங்கி கலாநிதி இந்திரஜித் குமாரசுவாமி ஐயா அவர்களுக்கு அரங்கு சார்பாக நிறைந்த நன்றிகளை கூறி மகிழ்கின்றோம்.